Welcome, everyone, to the On Poly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the Ontario government ponies up millions for infrastructure improvements in Prince Edward County. Oh, and there's a by-election there next week. We're confident that's just a coincidence.
Doug Ford says the breakup between the federal Liberals and NDP won't affect his decision on a possible early Ontario election.
Food bank usage has spiked in the province. One group is calling for change.
And in your column, my column, I'll look at what food banks have to do with housing policy.
And I wish I could tell you I had a column up this week, JMM, but I don't because the boss is still looking at it. So if he gets it up in the next little while, I'll have something to talk about.
It's Friday, September 13th, 2024, so let's get to it.
A bunch of things here. Hello again.
Hello, sir.
A bunch of things here before we get started. Number one, it occurred to me that I think since we started videoing this podcast, I have only worn shirts that have referred to places west of Toronto. So I thought today I'd show some love to the eastern part of the province. So I am an hour 45 east of Toronto with this one, Lakefield, Ontario. Okay. Beautiful spot. And there we go. Props to east of Toronto, not just west.
And we will be talking about east of Toronto later in the podcast as well.
We sure will. Now, I see you're not only east or west of Ontario, you're way up in the sky with that one.
Out of our jurisdiction entirely. I was feeling, what can I say, old and cranky this morning. And so this is the, when I was a kid, we had 9 planets. And I want to say at the breakfast table this morning, my kids started an argument with me about whether Pluto was actually a planet or not.
What's the verdict?
Well, I strongly maintain that Pluto is still a planet, and kids these days are being taught that it isn't.
I thought Pluto was a dog in a cartoon, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
That too.
Yeah. As much as we love talking Ontario politics, I think we have to acknowledge that the biggest political story in the world this past week was the presidential debate in the United States. So let's just, before we get to Queen's Park, do a minute on that. Did you watch?
I did. Did you?
I sure did. Did you watch every minute of it?
Yes, I stayed up late to watch that.
As did I. And, okay, what'd you think?
I thought it was an excellent debate in terms of the showcasing the candidates, if I could put it that way. I did not actually watch the prior debate with Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
That was the most consequential presidential debate ever.
I woke up the next morning and all I saw was the wailing and gnashing of teeth from Democrats. And I was like, oh, okay, I missed something important. So that was one reason why I made sure to catch this one.
There was one fascinating part about this Trump-Harris debate, and that was they did a lot of split screen. And when he was talking, the facial gestures she made while she was talking to convey disgust, astonishment, amazement, they were really quite something.
Yes.
They were really quite something. And I think, when you're a candidate up there, you not only get to try to influence the electorate when you are speaking, but when you are listening. And I thought she did a good job trying to convince people of the craziness of her opponent in some of the facial expressions she made when she was just listening.
Yes. And so one thing I wanted to bring up, you have moderated debates, obviously not U.S. debates, but you've moderated both provincial and federal debates before. And I got to ask, you've never had to handle somebody like Donald Trump. And there has been some criticism, primarily from conservatives in the States, about the moderators of this debate who, allegations of unfairness. I'm going to put my cards on the table and say that I thought they did an excellent job. But do you ever think about how would you handle somebody like Donald Trump?
I do think about that from time to time. And I guess the first conclusion I come to is I'm glad I've never had to do one of those because I can say I think I've done 3 federal and 4 provincial debates, and the candidates, the leaders on the debate stage in the debates that I've done have all, how do I say this, behaved. They've followed the rules. Yeah. The moderator's job is to enforce the rules. And so I'm going to take a bit of issue with you on the moderators of this debate at ABC. They did not enforce the rules as it related to who gets to speak when. To me, that was the biggest complaint I had about them, was that they did let Donald Trump say, I want another word, and they let him. And when you looked at the math after the debate was over, I think, what did he have, 7 or 8 more minutes of speaking time than her? Yeah. Now, you could argue that might not be good for his cause, but if part of the job of the moderator is to make sure that they get equal time, which is part of the job, they did not do well on that.
No, and the criticism that has come from the conservative side of the spectrum is that the fact checking that the moderators did of some of the more extreme claims that former President Trump made. There were really only, I think, 3 substantive moments where they really pushed back on correcting the factual record.
And eating the dogs and cats was one of them. Yeah.
I understand why, in general, moderators would not want to do that. It's not the job of the moderator to be debating the people
I agree.
on stage.
I've never thought it was the moderator's job to fact check.
And yet, there really were some extreme cases, some extreme claims, and I think it was important to not let some of the most outrageous falsehoods stand.
There is a problem, and look, I'm just saying this as an objective case. I'm not indicating a favorite one way or the other. The empirically provable fact of the matter is Donald Trump engages in more falsehoods, and the nature of his falsehoods are more breathtaking than any candidate for president ever. Yeah. And as a result, if the moderators have decided that fact-checking is part of their job, and apparently these ones had, then you can't be surprised that there was more fact-checking done on Trump than on Harris. Now, you could go after her for failing to answer questions. The very first question was, are Americans better off today than they were 5 years ago or 4 years ago? Yeah. And she didn't even answer that. Yeah. So, I mean, they should have been pressing her more on answering the question. They could have, I guess, if they wanted to fact check, could have fact checked him a lot more because there were a lot of bizarre falsehoods coming out of his mouth as well.
Yes.
And with that, we could go on this, but I suspect we should talk Queen's Park. On to issue one. This past Monday, the province announced nearly $19 million in funding for infrastructure to help support the construction of nearly 4,000 new homes in Prince Edward County. The money comes from the Housing Enabled Water Systems Fund that has been doling out money to cities across the province to upgrade their water systems.
Yeah, traditionally, you do need water to have a home, water, sewer, these kinds of things.
I believe that is true. Coincidentally, and I'm sure this is just a coincidence, the money was given ahead of a by-election, which will take place in the riding of Bay of Quinte, which is what it's called, Thursday, September 19th, to replace former Cabinet Minister Todd Smith. There are a number of candidates seeking your approval if you live in the Bay of Quinte area in the next election, and JMM is going to take you through them right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have Tyler Alsop for the Progressive Conservatives, who is a Belleville City Councillor. Sean Kelly is the Liberal candidate. He is also a Belleville City Councillor and is also a broadcaster. Amanda Robertson for the NDP is vice chair of the Hastings and Prince Edward District School Board. And the Greens are represented by Lori Borthwick, who is a healthcare worker.
Here is the latest on the stay of play in the riding of Bay of Quinte. Liaison was in the field, I guess, Sunday and Monday earlier this week. They surveyed 541 voters. There's a margin of error in this poll of plus or minus 4.21%, 19 times out of 20. I think by law we have to say all that stuff. This race is tight. Kelly of the Liberals is in first with 36%. Alsop of the Conservatives next at 35%. Then comes Robertson of the NDP at 18%. Borthwick of the Greens at 5%. That is about as close as it gets.
Absolutely. So, I mean, let's start by warning our listeners, I guess, that, polling by elections in Canada, notoriously tricky. I think lots of pollsters have been embarrassed by the results after the fact. I will not be surprised if the eventual numbers are different from what we just reported there. Just to give people an example, folks may remember the Milton by-election earlier this year. There was some polling suggested that would be a very close race. It ended up not being terribly close. That said, let's take these numbers for what they are right now. If the Liberals were to manage to carry this riding, it would be, I think in some ways it would be more important than if they had carried Milton. This was a riding that Todd Smith held from 2011 on. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, in the last two election cycles, he won it by really large margins, like 15, 20% margins. And so if the Liberals were, in fact, able to take this seat from the Progressive Conservatives, that would be a sign that they are at least competitive in a part of the province where they really haven't been for quite some time.
Yeah. The nice thing about by-elections is that the people who live in those areas, they feel the love from all the parties intensely for a very short period of time. Because, of course, this is not a general election where people are campaigning everywhere. You can afford to put everything in the kitchen sink into this. The leaders have all been to Bay of Quinte. There are door knockers for all parties that have been to Bay of Quinte. I'm hearing from Liberal sources that there's still a great deal of antipathy to the Prime Minister, even though he's federal. This is provincial. Yeah. A lot of antipathy to Justin Trudeau still, which may depress the Liberal vote. You never know. Yep. On the other hand, there's a lot of concern about the current government of Ontario. So we'll see. We'll see.
Absolutely. And just one other point about the election. Even if the Liberals do not, in fact, carry it, the other thing to watch will be if they do a strong second, right, that would still be at least one positive indicator, because in the last 2 elections in Bay of Quinte, they were a distant third. Yeah. It was the NDP were the second place party. So there are a few ways that this could be somewhat good news for the Liberal Party.
Now, speaking of elections, we've had some developments about 2 current MPPs in the Ontario legislature that we want to pass along. Whenever the next Ontario election is, and you know if you've been keeping up that we don't know when that is yet, Rick Byers, who is the Tory MPP for Bruce Grey Owen Sound, and Monique Taylor, who is the New Democrat MPP for Hamilton Mountain, they have both announced that they are not going to contest the next Ontario election whenever it is. Taylor, for her part, has also announced that she's going to try to run federally for the NDP in the next federal election. Now, in terms of the history, Hamilton Mountain has been an NDP riding provincially since 2011, so that will be a challenge for any other party to take. Bruce Grey Owen Sound, boy, you want to talk about a strong Tory seat? It's been Tory since the new boundaries were formed in 1999. The predecessor ridings that make up the current boundaries were Tory since 1990. So that's a pretty safe bet.
The escarpment lifted out of the ocean.
Something big would have to happen for the Conservatives to lose that seat.
Yeah, and I also note that Rick Byers was only elected for the first time in the last election, so it is notable to me that he's choosing not to run again. But you can see pieces in motion, right? They're setting the chessboard, right? We know that progressive Conservatives have been told basically to make their decision soon about whether they are running again or not. I suspect similar messaging is going out to the New Democrats. I know the Liberals are obviously, as you know, one of the smallest parties. They have lots of candidates to recruit. I know they are really busy doing that. So it's very interesting watching all the machinery of election planning start spinning up.
And with that, we're off to issue 2. On the national stage, the New Democratic Party has ended the supply and confidence deal with the Liberals, ending the agreement that has helped keep Justin Trudeau the Prime Minister and given the NDP some legislative wins they otherwise might not have had. This obviously brings the prospects of a federal election into the nearer future. Premier Doug Ford, however, he has other ideas.
Yes, at a news conference on Monday, Doug Ford said he believed that Jagmeet Singh wouldn't trigger an election until after a very specific date. Let's take a listen.
As far as I'm concerned, MP Singh he's just blowing smoke. There's nothing more important to these greedy politicians than collecting a pension. And he was elected in October 2019, and October 19th, 2019. And I'll be floored, and I'll stand up here and apologize to all the greedy politicians if he calls the election early.
Yeah, the Premier got the date wrong, actually, when he said the pensions kick in as of such and such a date. He corrected himself at another news conference on Wednesday of this week, because I think the record shows Singh was first elected as the MP in Burnaby South in British Columbia in February 2019, prior to the fall 2019 election. It was a by-election. Mr. Singh's pension eligibility, therefore, would actually kick in sooner than it would for other MPs who were elected that year. The question then becomes, how big a factor is pension eligibility when opposition politicians start to think about when they want to pull the plug on the federal Liberals? What do you think?
I don't think that Singh personally is terribly worried about being re-elected in Burnaby South, right? That would be the issue for him personally. But he does have a caucus to answer to, right? So maybe it will be a factor in his decision. But, you know, trying to force an election is such a big move. There's never just one factor to consider. And I would expect that in this case, it would be a relatively small one. We should also note that the NDP actually doesn't have the numbers to force an election if they choose to vote no confidence in the government. They have to get the Bloc Québécois to agree with them, which puts Prime Minister Trudeau in a bit of a nicer spot, a bit more comfortable spot, because he has more negotiating partners. But it necessarily makes the timing of an election more complicated.
Yeah, if the Bloc supports the Prime Minister, they're good to go.
Yep,
they're still good to go. Now, as you might imagine, Jagmeet Singh, when he heard what Doug Ford had to say about him, decided that he wanted to make a few comments too. So why don't we play what he had to say next? Absolutely. Sheldon, if you would.
I think Doug Ford needs to worry about delivering health care for people in Canada instead of being obsessed with alcohol. People in Ontario can't get the health care they need. They're struggling with the cost of living, and he's obsessed with alcohol and convenience stores. Like, I don't know any person that I've spoken to when I tour Ontario, when I'm in the communities, that say that that's their number one pressing issue.
Shots fired, I believe the kids say. I think it's also fair to remind our listeners that while city councillors, mayors, and MPs, federal MPs, all have pensions, provincial MPPs do not.
Correct.
In Ontario. Doug Ford will not get a pension from his time as premier, nor will any current MPP. We've talked before about how that shapes the choices of provincial politicians, but we have a clear case at hand, right? Todd Smith has said that one of the reasons for his retirement and seeking private sector employment and thereby causing this by-election in Bay of Quinte is because he's at the point in his life where he needs to think about retirement security, and MPPs don't have pensions.
It is amazing how many people think Ontario legislators have gold-plated pensions like the federal members do. We should remind everybody that it was Premier Mike Harris in the 1990s who got rid of the pension. It's been almost 30 years since MPPs did not have pensions at Queen's Park. So for all of those of you who think these greedy buggers, they're only after their pensions, they don't have pensions, and they haven't for almost 30 years. Now, I know we're all skeptical about politics. That is just the nature of the beast. And none of us can imagine that MPs would risk not being eligible for their pensions, and therefore they will allow the Trudeau government to remain in place because, of course, they want it to stay there long enough for them to be eligible for their pensions. However, this is where I need to remind everybody that that was exactly the kind of thinking that took place back in 1979, and I remember this well. The Conservatives were in power. They had a minority government in the federal parliament. They were convinced that the opposition Liberals would never jeopardize their pensions by defeating Joe Clark's government, because many people at that stage were not yet eligible for pensions. But the Liberals did. They did pull the plug on Joe Clark. They did force an election. They ran the risk of not getting pensions if Clark came back with a majority, for example. The current prime minister's father came out of retirement. He'd already stepped down. He came out of retirement to lead the Liberals to a majority government in 1980 in the next election. So it did work out well for those Liberal opposition members. I guess the lesson here is don't be so sure about what you think you know about people's motives, because you never know. And with that, we're on to issue 3. According to a new report, more than 1 million people used a food bank last year in the province of Ontario. The high cost of living is the most significant factor why people visit, and we know this because of an organization that tracks this information. Tell us more.
Right. So this is from Feed Ontario, which is a network of provincial food banks. They issued their annual report, and those 1 million people represent the largest single increase in food bank usage since the 2008 recession. Just really want to put a point on that. This is higher rates of food bank usage than we saw in the 2008 recession, and more than we saw during COVID. The report asked food bank clients various questions, and they found that 71% of respondents said they are worse off now than they were pre-pandemic. More than 2/3 of visitors had only $100 left each month after housing costs, and 22% said their housing costs exceeded their monthly income. We can use food bank usage, I think, as a bellwether for extreme economic precarity, right? These are places that people go to as a last resort when they are worried about losing housing if they can't pay their rent. They don't have enough money for both rent and groceries, so they go to the food banks.
In terms of recommendations, what does the Feed Ontario report have to say?
Well, unsurprisingly, they say, one solution to this is to increase the income supports that we have for people in this province. That includes the Ontario Disability Support Program and Ontario Works, more affordable housing, and particularly more affordable rental housing. The very large majority of food bank clients are renters. They are not the majority of people province-wide, so that gives you a sense of how particularly vulnerable renters are in this province. They make a recommendation for not necessarily like more employment, because unemployment is not historically high right now, but they do say that people are working full-time jobs and still not able to afford what they need to. So it's not just more jobs, it's better jobs, better paying jobs, so that people don't have to make that choice between rent and the groceries.
This is obviously a huge issue, so we should mention as well that our pal Nam Kiwanuka, hosts a show called The Thread. They have a great episode on food insecurity in Ontario. And if you are listening on podcast right now, we will put a link to the description of that show in the show notes, and you can find it there. It is on YouTube. And with that, it's off to your column, my column. Okay, time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for TVO.org over the past week. Start us off. What do you got?
Well, talking about that food bank report that we were just discussing, I mean, one of the points that I wanted to make about this is really the centrality of the housing crisis in Ontario, right? It is eating up everything. And the housing crisis is different from other economic problems, right? When there's a recession, when there's a period of high inflation, in general, we know how to manage them, and things tend to return back to the normal economic progress that we are used to. The housing crisis is different because when you pump more money into the system, when people make more money, when people get raises, when people form new households, all the things that we want them to do, it just makes the housing crisis worse unless we figure out how to address this issue. There were some other headlines this week that frankly made me despair about the current state of housing policy in Ontario. I'm not currently very optimistic about how we're going to move forward on that, but it's something that I think everybody needs to take seriously, because in the current state of affairs, it's almost as if good economic news isn't even possible, right? People get raises, and that money gets siphoned away by the banks that own mortgages and the landlords who own rental units, and people are in a very sort of structural way. People can't get ahead, and governments like economic good news. They like to run on economic good news, and it's just harder and harder to get that actual good news. Even as I say this in the column, there have been plenty of times in Ontario's recent history where the economy was much worse, and I don't want to dismiss the real hardships that people are going through now, but you and I have both seen much more severe recessions.
For sure.
Given how relatively well the economy is doing right now, it should not be the case that 1 million people are using food banks.
No question. Now, this may be a good opportunity for us to explain to the good people watching and listening that when you and I have an idea for a column, we don't just sit down and type it into the TVO website and it bingo shows up. We actually have to pitch the idea to an editor who either approves it or doesn't. Then when we write the column, the said editor, and maybe a second editor as well, vets the column and just make sure no spelling mistakes, no grammar mistakes, no factual mistakes, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I have a column that is in the process of being vetted. It is not up on the website yet. I hope, as we tape this right now, it's not up yet, but essentially the piece is about a follow-up on a column I wrote before about how much cooperation the opposition either is or is not prepared to do to try to defeat the Ford government. The example I used in the last column was in France, where the opposition parties cooperated to stop the far right from winning. This column is about what's happened in British Columbia over the last couple of weeks, which has been fascinating.
Yes.
The party that used to be the Liberals is not running candidates in this election, not even the leader. They have stood down, and they have in fact told some of their candidates, you go run for the Conservatives, because we don't want to split the anti-NDP vote between too many parties. So we now have our first example in Canada of opposition parties cooperating in order to try to defeat a government that they obviously would like to kick out. And I merely say, Ontario opposition parties, New Democrats, Liberals, Greens, are you paying attention? This has happened in France. It's now happening in British Columbia. It might be something you want to consider here. Not recommending it, just putting it out there for your edification. That's all.
It is a fascinating case in BC because, I think functionally, the party formerly known as the BC Liberals is going to cease to exist. And that's, I think, the crucial difference. In Ontario, I don't think any of either the New Democrats or the Ontario Liberals is ready to strike their tents and walk away.
We cannot imagine that. No. They're both, frankly, they both get about 25% of the vote right now, so that's a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, the BC Liberals were... Mind you, the BC Liberals were the government of British Columbia 7 years ago. Yeah. So it just shows you how fast.
We're not talking about the mists of prehistory here.
Things can change quickly in this country. Okay, and with that, let's go to the mailbag. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, please send it to us at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, start us off if you would.
Right, so we have a question from an anonymous listener or viewer. It goes, Hi there. I am an employee of the town of Cobourg, and recently the mayor of Cobourg, Lucas Cleveland, has suggested the town should consider leaving Northumberland County and floated that Cobourg, Port Hope, and Hamilton Township merge into a city of around 50,000. How would such a departure and merger work, and what impacts would it have not only on the local governments, but Northumberland County and the province? Kind regards, Anonymous. And if they're an employee of the town, you can understand why we are keeping them anonymous.
Exactly. And we love these kinds of questions, which are deeply nerdy and into the weeds. Yes. And I have a feeling that the answer to this question has something to do with the expression, municipalities are creatures of the province. So why don't you start us with some background on that?
Well, the short answer is you're exactly correct. But the longer answer, we're going to get into some context here. So for folks who don't know, Northumberland County is east of the GTA, and the entire county has a population of about 90,000 people, with Cobourg having about 20,000 people. It's one of 7 smaller municipalities that make up the county. Generally, we're talking about smaller towns with very large rural areas surrounding them. And there has been some tension between the county and the town of Cobourg recently over the issue of homelessness in particular. This is not an issue that is at all exclusive to Cobourg. The county has bought a building that they want to open a homeless shelter in Cobourg, while the town has imposed some licensing rules, and they want to set a bunch of conditions in place before the shelter opens. That's one possible reason for the tension that we're seeing, and one reason why we might see this proposal floated by the mayor. That said, the question of whether Cobourg, Port Hope, and Hamilton Township could be sliced off from Northumberland County, it's not that different in practice from the question of whether Mississauga can be sliced off from Peel Region. It is absolutely within the legislature's powers to redraw the boundaries of a municipality if MPPs choose to do that. But as we saw with the Mississauga case, it is also a much more complicated question than simply redrawing lines on a map. The current government decided that it was not worth the political headache to try and untangle that municipal situation. It is not just a matter of redrawing the lines on the map. You have to reassign responsibilities for all of the work that, in this case, the county does currently for the people of Cobourg and Port Hope and Hamilton Township, that they would expect a lot of those services to continue, and you have to figure that out.
I think the point you made about the political risk that the current government of Ontario is prepared to undertake in order to affect this, if in fact this is the way to go, that's huge right now. Because if in fact they are going to call an early election, an election a year early, as in next spring, you would not want one of what has traditionally been a pretty safe Conservative seat. You would not want the good burghers of that constituency to be furious with you because you've done something that will irritate a large number for whom this might be, the single most important issue on which they'd want to vote. So you can imagine how the government stood down on Mississauga and why they weren't prepared to accept the headache here. You can imagine they'd do the same thing here.
Well, and just to add, I was looking at the numbers before we started shooting, and if I have my math right, we're talking about slicing off half of the population of Northumberland County and creating this separate municipality. And whatever that might mean for the people of Cobourg and Port Hope and Hamilton Township, it would leave Northumberland County with half of its population, and I'm going to guess less than half of its property tax base, and all of the residents of the new, smaller county would quite understandably be furious and would have all sorts of headaches to figure out and bills to pay.
Changing regional boundaries is never controversial. They did it in Thunder Bay 50 years ago between Fort William and Port Arthur, and they're still discussing it 50 years later about whether or not Queen's Park done them wrong by changing the boundaries there and creating one super city. Anyways, to be continued, as they say. Why don't you give the email just in case other nerds want to get in on this?
Again, if you'd like to ask about the content on the show, please aim us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And just before we go, a shout out to the folks in Mississauga. On Sunday, we will be at the Hazel McCallion Central Library for a conversation asking the question, will Gen Z, or Gen Z, I guess if we're in Canada, reboot democracy? That's for a program we do before live audiences called TVO Today Live. And you can join that audience if you like. Also, you can attend the world premiere screening of a new TVO series. It's called Unrigged, hosted by democracy advocate Dave Meslin. And that's all starting at 3 p.m. on Sunday. For more information, or for that matter, to see past episodes, go to tvo.org/TVO Today Live. That's tvo.org/TVO Today Live. And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, September 13th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. And unless you really desperately need to stay anonymous, please include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's digital media services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Laurie Few is the executive producer of digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks to our studio crew here for making this place look so darn good. And let's do a shout out this week to the guy who I hope is keeping me in focus right back there on camera 3, Chad Castle, who, although he's a Montreal Canadian fan, and I can never forgive him for that, is the funniest guy on the set here, and we love him for that. Okay, folks, until next Friday, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.